I'm Ron Stone Jr., and this is Deer Park, as the sign says, the birthplace of Texas, because here in 1836, Texas won its independence from Mexico at the Battle of San Jacinto. I can't tell you how many times I came here as a kid with my father. We walked around and he would tell me about Santa Anna, Sam Houston. It was a great battle, all right, but there have been many others in the story of Deer Park. Folks here have to deal with everything from Indian attacks to floods and hurricanes, heat, humidity, even a blizzard that came through right before the great storm of 1900. All this and much more, part of the story of Deer Park. Join us. In the time before the white man came to the Texas Gulf Coast, the area, roughly 10 square miles of what was to become Deer Park, Texas, was Indian country and prime hunting and fishing land. With an elevation of 24 feet above sea level, its tendency to flood during storms always seemed to revitalize the soil, which grew an abundant number of trees and grass, each of these a favorite of wild game. As the Spanish and French arrived in greater numbers, the days of the Indians were fading, but not the tough life around the Deer Park area. Deer Park at the start of the 1800s was mostly ranch land. The closest semi-civilized villages were to the south, towards Galveston. Near the future site of Houston was the town of Harrisburg, a small community along Buffalo Bayou. It was this wild frontier country that brought Texas forefathers to settle here and make their fortunes in the new western expansion. It didn't take long before many of those Texians, as they called themselves, were not satisfied with being ignored by the Mexican government more than 1,000 miles away. History shows that Mexico considered Texas a backwater territory. There were just not enough money-making enterprises at the time to make it significant to the Mexican government. By the 1830s, the Texians began to rebel openly against Mexico, and the winds of revolution started blowing across Texas. Both Mexican citizens and Anglo-Americans wanted to control their own laws and regulations, and with it, their future. In 1835, when General Martin Cos, the brother-in-law of General Santa Anna, was sent to southeast Texas to put down uprisings against Mexican customs officials, Texians took notice. Volunteers gathered in many small towns in Texas to do their part. Names like Goliad, San Antonio, and the Alamo raced through Texas like prairie fire. Seeing that Cos would not be able to put down the growing number of separatists, General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna marched north with a larger army. Men from Texas and the United States each took their place in history. Names like Crockett, Bowie, Travis, Zavala, Seguin, men who wanted more than what was being offered by the Mexican government. By March the 6th, 1836, the Alamo had fallen. General Sam Houston took the remainder of the Texas Army into retreat to train those men and gather more volunteers. San Jacinto, near Deer Park, was the end of the line and the beginning of a new Texas.
That's where we started as a republic. That's where we won the battle at. That's the finite point of where it was. So who am I to say it shouldn't be called the birthplace of Texas? I think everybody, if they really look at it logically, that would be the starting point of Texas.
Houston says Deer Park in those days was nothing more than a spot on an old route that came up from Galveston as far as Buffalo Bayou. It was a rallying point for the people before and after the battle. But the history of that battle has been told many times, and sometimes just off the mark.
We talk about history, and it always brings to mind sometimes we don't get history right. And I think one of the prime examples of that was the picture of General Houston underneath the tree at San Jacinto with his right ankle bandaged. And he was actually shot in the left ankle, and nobody ever caught that. But yet Andrew Jackson Houston wrote a book on the Battle of San Jacinto, and in that book he said that General Houston was shot by a Mexican using what they called an escopito, which was kind of like a boarding gun that old pirates used to use, and it was filled with brass balls, and it killed the horse and it injured Houston in the left ankle. And that book was out there for years, yet here was a picture hanging. Nobody had ever looked at the two together.
Houston explains that the Battle of San Jacinto was much more than luck, as some people would say. The evidence holds more clues that point to General Houston's use of Indian tactics of outweighting your opponent.
We can only suppose. But I would think that his training with the Indians, his life with the Indians years before, had something to do with that, in that here he came, he slept through the whole morning of the 21st, and everybody's wanting clamor to go. And he took a war council, and his officers, his senior officers voted against attacking, wait another day, and the junior officers wanted to attack, a couple of them. And he went back to sleep and got back up and decided it was time to go. I guess he had reports of the army, the Mexican army, being reinforced by a group that had come in earlier on in the day, and I can't help but believe that he realized that he was going to catch him off guard.
One can't help feel that Sam Houston IV was very much like his famous ancestor, General Sam Houston, and that credit should go to where it belongs.
The people made Texas, of course, but the battle formed Texas, let them form the Republic.
When Sam Houston allowed his army to be bottled up with their backs against the bayou and river, it seemed to Santa Anna that his army was in a perfect position to finish the Texas army off. But late in the afternoon, as Houston received information that Mexican reinforcements were coming, he placed his infantry in front, the cavalry to the right, and 2 cannon called the Twin Sisters as backup, and he attacked the Mexican army and caught them off guard. The Texas Army formed up around 3 o'clock that afternoon of April the 21st. A single line of Texians, 1,000 feet long, walked with rifles, tomahawks, and bowie knives. The Texians held their fire to within 20 yards, and then 800 rifles decimated the Mexican ranks. The Mexican troops could not form their lines fast enough. They were cut down like so much hay in the field. The battle took only a few minutes, 18 in all, but it took hours for Texians to capture the Mexican soldiers who had tried to flee. Many were captured, but not all. Some fell to Texas forces who were enraged about losing friends and countrymen at the Alamo and Goliad. After the battle, General Santa Anna could not be found. It was later the next day that Santa Anna was found wearing a private's uniform. And so a very much captured and defeated Santa Anna was brought to one of the cabins in use by the Texas Army. A replica of the cabin owned by Dr. George Moffett Patrick has been recreated and now stands on Deer Park City property downtown.
In 1936, when Texas celebrated its centennial, they put a marker out where the cabin originally stood on what is now Roman House property, stating that this was where the battle was won, and that in the cabin of Dr. George Moffett Patrick, Sam Houston, President Barnett, the Texas Army, and Santa Anna met in the cabin to draft the Treaty of Texas Independence.
After the battle, the Deer Park area returned to cattle ranching and farming, but at the close of the 1800s, destiny once again picked this place in Texas to move forward.
In the early 1890s, they announced the construction of a railroad from Houston to LaPorte, down to across San Jacinto River, up north as a way of shipping out of Houston, and this opened up all the ranch land that was out here. And almost overnight, you had the town of Pasadena, Deepwater, Deer Park, Lomax, Strang, Richland, LaPorte, and Bayview. All of them were incorporated, and if you were not incorporated, they were platted. And if you lay all the plats together, almost all the ranch land was now platted as farming communities, basically.
Advertisements started showing up in newspapers all across the United States speaking of a heaven on earth. Come south and farm. But even the hardiest farmers of the Great Plains were about to experience what toughness and Texas have in common.
They started bringing what they call excursion trains down from the north. The farmers up in the north, because it was economic tight times, they were losing their farms. The weather was such a, snow and all that. So here's this advertisement, come down south. You can grow year round. It's wonderful. And that if the excursion fare was like $15, and if you bought a lot, you got the $15 back.
The farming land around an infant deer park was said to be the best for fruit trees, pears, figs, and oranges. Then came a man with vision to spare, Simeon Henry West, the founder of Deer Park.
In 1892, Mr. Simeon West came down to Deer Park from Illinois. He had built an old hotel, well, it was a new hotel at the time. He made sure that he had access to bringing the railroad here as well as the ship channel.
Deer Park was a dream built on agriculture, a bounty of fruits and vegetables, all bound for the nearby and hungry city of Galveston. But before this place could really hit its stride, it got a strange and unwelcome visitor from the north. Of all things, a blizzard. The Houston Post newspaper reports in 1895 that snow fell on February 13th and 14th, measuring 22 inches deep. The Post also reports that in 1899, the temperature dropped to 8 degrees and the upper portion of the bay froze over. Yet another record for those living in Deer Park to endure. West's dream of creating a city was done with the most detail possible. West named Deer Park for the large herds of deer that lived there, and West then began to reserve water rights, streetcar right-of-ways, and even reserved space for the electrical and telephone lines of the future. West Avenue was originally named for Simeon West, but later the name was changed to Center Street. West named one of the streets in his future city Luella after his daughter, and X Street was also named by West. These two streets are all that remain of the original Deer Park. Simeon West's 13,000 fruit trees that he had planted on arrival were on the verge of something great. In the time of the season when fruit was not ripe, he planted corn and cabbage and other crops that sold well in Galveston. But freezing temperatures were not all the danger that a young Deer Park faced.
By 1900, the hurricane came through, and the last of the farmers that came down here decided to chuck it in and go back, because in 1895 they had a hard freeze, 24 inches of snow, which is still the record here in Deer Park. In 1899 they had 8 degrees. Galveston Bay froze over. 1900 they had the hurricane. So it was like, so much for a tropical south, I'm going back home. So the town became basically a ghost town after 1900. Mr. West threw in the towel in 1905, sold his remaining land. They had built a nice 2-story, 24-room hotel, and a guy by the name of Farmer Brown acquired that and just ranched. And that's what they did from 1900 to about 1928. This was just ranch land.
For those that remained to keep the remnants of Deer Park alive, it was hard living. The original families found getting a doctor out from Houston was a tough ordeal.
Of course, they had the country-type doctors, at that time. And the doctors really rode horseback at very first.
While they waited on their pregnant patients to go into delivery, it is said that the country doctors spent their time hunting and fishing. And there was another bright light on the horizon for Deer Park. You could see it to the east near Beaumont. It was called Spindletop, the first big oil well in Texas.
We had the Spindletop 1901. Okay, that was all of a sudden Texas has oil. And they started looking for oil around here and found all sorts of little fields, Baytown, Goose Creek, Humble, and all of those around here. And a guy by the name of J.S. Cullinan, who organized the Texas Company, or Texaco as we know it today, was looking for a place to build a tank farm and a refinery. And Orange, Texas, was trying to court him, but he got to looking at this work that they were doing on what they call the Port of Houston and the Houston Ship Channel. And Houston was thinking of it as a port at the end of a long water course. And Cullinan said, it's a long wharf. You know, the whole mileage on either side. Refineries need large plots of land, they need water. This is an excellent, so he was credited with making Houston the oil capital of the world. And you had Sinclair, you had Crown, you had Exxon, Humble Oil, but then Exxon. So Shell was just coming down here to buy land where everybody else was building.
And that's what turned the tide for Deer Park as we know it today. And yet, the Deer Park you see today looks nothing like it did the year that Shell came to town.
It was 1928, 28 and 29, that Deer Park really began to grow, and that's when Shell Oil Company came here. And they had to use mules and things like that in order to even build Shell out there. They brought their workers down and they built tents, or they had tents for the Shell workers.
Shell used the first school building in Deer Park that was built in 1910 and long since abandoned as an office for its engineers and staff. That little white schoolhouse was located on what is now the entrance to Shell Chemical Plant at Center and Highway 225. The schoolhouse, when no longer needed by Shell, was loaned to the community as a place to hold church services. Then, in the late 1930s, it was torn down and the lumber was used to construct the First Baptist Church at 6th and Center. With the coming of Shell, the town showed a new sign of life. Within 10 years of Shell moving in, Deer Park had 48 houses, a school district, and even welcomed President Franklin Roosevelt as his train passed the tracks originally planned by Simeon West before the turn of the century. As Shell Oil began to build in Deer Park, the next decade would put the town on the map. Coming out of the Great Depression and into the early days of World War II, the petroleum industry expanded to meet the needs of a world at war. By the end of that war, the population of Deer Park was a few hundred people. By 1948, the population more than 700, and the city was incorporated. Former mayor of Deer Park, Jimmy Burke, moved with his family to Deer Park in 1947.
We had the opportunity to live in an Austin stone house out on the San Jacinto battleground at the time. That was quite a playground for a second grader. Rode the school bus back and forth to the schoolhouse on Ivy Street. Quite an experience at that time. Very nice facility at that time because Shell had already showed up and began to boost the economy of the city. I can well remember the white Shell streets in Deer Park at that time. That's what Center Street was at that time, and up to about 13th Street, and from there on south it was an old Red Rock Road.
The first new school building was built on Ivy Street, and when completed, it housed teachers and administrators and taught 35 students. One of the many blessings with having a billion-dollar industry right in your backyard is the tax base that can be used for the best schools in the area. Anything that Deer Park schools wanted was provided. And if you can believe this, at one point, the school children actually ate their lunches off of fine china and drank from crystal stemware. From the china and crystal to the state champion teams of Deer Park schools, education has been a mainstay for the city and its industry. Founder Simeon West's dream of a community of opportunity had become a reality. Deer Park, at last count, had about 22 petro and or chemical plants in its industrial district, with the number growing each year.
Our industrial district is a part of that whole Houston Ship Channel complex, which contributes about $18 billion annually to Texas economy, and we're very pleased to be a part of that. Otherwise, light industry-wise in city, through those same period of years, we have developed a very aesthetically pleasing light industrial park, both on the east and west sides of the city of Deer Park, with a very nicely developed retail area right down through the center of Deer Park, along Center Street, which virtually is the center of town.
Burke and other city planners over the years give the success of Deer Park partially to good planning and steady growth. If patience is a virtue, then Deer Park is indeed a virtuous city.
Deer Park is what you would call a planned community. Early on, when Shell started their plant here, they took responsibility for the company town, is what it was. And so if the company town needed a school, they built a school. The company town needed a library, they built a library. But it was controlled growth. Unlike all these other communities that they build up one area and okay, they need more land, so they move to another spot, The city of Pasadena doesn't have a downtown. Everything is linear there as they moved out. Deer Park controlled, slow in their growth, picked what they wanted. One of the things is they kept the apartments percentage low.
After more than 100 years and counting, Deer Park boasts more than 9,000 homes and more than 30,000 residents. The school district that started in a small cabin for a few families now has 14 campuses that are spread throughout the city. Deer Park also has plenty to do for its residents, with libraries, parks, recreational facilities, and community theaters. Jimmy Burke and others agree that there is a great deal to learn from the founders of Deer Park and those that brought it back to life.
It's an important lesson, I think, for youngsters to learn. That you need to have some vision, you need to do some planning, you need to set some goals and some action items to see that those goals come to fruition, and thank goodness through the years the City Fathers of Deer Park have been able to accomplish that. And
Burke and others living here have a name for their Deer Park community. They call it the gracious little city on the golden plains of the great Gulf Coast.
We have a hometown atmosphere. We still feel like that this is a small town community. We're just about to run out of place to build homes, but that's a good problem, I guess, in a way. But we have a lot of nice homes that are being built in the area. We're close to Houston, where you can have just about any type of entertainment that you want. We're close to the San Jacinto Monument. We're close to NASA. We're surrounded by a lot of historical things in this area that a person, they wanted to just take some time to review what our history is. Not just Deer Park, but Texas. It's all in this area right here. We have a lot of diversity in our religious activities in our city. We have a lot of churches. We have just about any denomination that you'd want to attend, with the exception of a few, and they're within a short driving area of this city.
While the future of Deer Park is secure, just what that future holds can't be known. What we do know is this: the strength of this city lies in its people and their ability to change with the times. If there is one place that has its future secure, it is this place, Deer Park, Texas, the birthplace of Texas. I'm Ron Stone Jr. Thanks for watching.